And that's something that, like, you could feel that in the air. And I think when you go back and reference, like, when our children say, what was it like when coronavirus was going on? You got to remember how intensely scared and worked up people were, and how much that would cloud their judgment on every other thing. And it seems odd to me that all of the restrictions that they put in place when they were in panic mode are still the exact same ones. Nobody's been like, okay, now that the craziness has happened, now we can look at what's working and what's not, and let's roll some of these back. All of them are still on in full force, if not harder now.
Yeah, and that's concerning. I was hoping some of that would die away with the whole election being behind us, but obviously this is global, and that's not happening. We still see a continued focus on, even after the vaccine, they want masks and they want social distancing, and there doesn't seem to be any exit strategy for this, which is concerning because there is no scoreboard for the negative consequences of the reaction. That's just all getting swept under the rug. We do see notes in many papers that have come out on the harms of lockdown, and they seem to be ignored. There's a lot of concern from the UN and others in third world countries. There's going to be starvation and at scale that just dwarfs by orders of magnitude the coronavirus deaths that are on the table. So the proportionality in response is just gone. And I think a lot of people are frustrated that the people running the show have conflicts of interest. At least I hear a lot of this about the Sage Group in the UK. Many of those people are involved in either testing companies or vaccine companies, so they see the science through the solution they have in their hand. I don't, we're all human. I can see that happening. If you happen to be in that field, you're going to be very pro-vaccine. And I think what Pfizer's done is amazing. Like, the technology they have behind that vaccine is just stunning what they've pulled off. They've synthesized, I think it's 4,284 base long RNA, 30 micrograms in every injection. That's an incredible synthesis feat when you have to 5' cap it. They changed.
What does that mean? It's like, slow that way down.
They have to make this RNA molecule that's 4,284 letters long. That's a very hard RNA molecule to make. And in the process of doing so, they've had to put in pseudouracil inside of they replace one base in there, the uracil base, with a different one called pseudouracil. It's a non-native nucleotide, but they do this because that nucleotide protects the RNAs from getting degraded by nucleases. So it lasts longer in your system. It doesn't just get eaten up by your cells. And then they also put a 5' cap on it and a 3' cap. These are things that protect the RNA from degrading as quickly as it does. And that's been the main weakness of the approach. This is why you need 2 injections, is that the RNA is not replication competent. It doesn't replicate on its own per se inside your cells. So it has to be there long enough for some protein to get made for your immune system to recognize it, but it needs two injections to do it. But that's an absolute stunning feat of DNA synthesis or RNA synthesis. It's just, they've done an amazing job there, but it's been rushed. I'm not jumping in front of line to get to it. I'm going to kind of wait and see what happens. But so if you're involved in that, I think, everyone's high-fiving each other over what a feat that is. And actually that's going to probably skew your interpretation of what should be done with coronavirus. But I'm a little concerned that there's so much regulatory capture in a lot of these agencies that we're not really seeing the true science filter through here. We're seeing the lobbied interest run the show. And that's a little bit of, I don't know how to reverse that other than a change in how the media is operating right now, because I think a lot of the media is in fact captured by many of these organizations.
Well, so you're an interesting character in that you really despise or dislike the regulation that goes into the world of medicine and the application of it.
I don't despise the idea of standards and regulation. I despise when they're centralized and they're easily bought off. Because that tends to create a lot more power for the incumbent than it does for the entrepreneur. And it seems to be our government, the larger it gets, it seems to be more prone to this, right? So when you looked at what happened with hydroxychloroquine and with ivermectin, you've got physicians from around the world that are screaming to get this to people. These are generic drugs that had safety profiles that were well understood. Why the hell were those held back in the United States? And the only pattern you can put together, and granted this is connecting dots and maybe deemed conspiratorial, but is that they were trying to promote remdesivir, which was patented in $3,000 a pop, as opposed to $20 solutions that were generic, and there weren't really an advocate for in Congress, right? The generic owners of these drugs aren't pooling their resources to go and present to Congress why their drug should be at the front line, or trying to court Fauci over what should be the standard of care. But the standard of care was the worst drug we had. If you look at all the studies on remdesivir, it is clearly the shittiest drug we've got for this, yet it became the standard of care. And I can only explain that by regulatory capture. I don't have proof of it, but no data supports it, and yet it gets frontlined. And then we had all of these things.
Kevin, you're like a super serious scientist. So have you found yourself in the past in this same kind of like conspiratorial warped world? Like to me, this has to be like an alarming experience for you as like somebody that is now crossed the Rubicon and started questioning orthodoxy, but like to the extent that you're saying this is a grand conspiracy, like people are making huge sums of money over this, and we may want to look at it.
I don't know that it has to be very grand. I think you can have lots of parallel entities that have interests that happen to align, and that they're all pushing for the same thing. And so it looks like a scientific consensus to those that are in power trying to make decisions. And their attention is always paid to the people who have top dollar. And that's just how the political system works. But, you don't necessarily need to have, some type of great reset level of conspiracy to make this happen. Like this could simply happen out of market forces when the market is so disturbed by the political forces that seem to control it all. Like we don't really have a free market making these decisions. We have a market that is highly controlled and highly regulated through DC, which turns everyone away from funding entrepreneurs to funding lobbying groups to push their drugs. So you don't have to have the best drug. You have to have the best connections in Congress and in DC to move things along. And that significantly, I think, discredits or is a big disadvantage to anything that's generic that doesn't have a single owner with deep pockets. So these generic drugs, I think, got overlooked for this very reason. And you would think that that's what the NIH is there for, right? The NIH should be looking for areas of market failure and promoting them, knowing the market's probably not going to dig their feet into generic drugs. But we didn't see that with the NIH. We saw the NIH promoting remdesivir and many of these vaccine approaches, and they have some patent estate connections to those. So the NIH isn't doing this market correction thing that we're hoping it would do. It seems to be an amplifier of the lobbying process.
When we talk about hydrochloroquine, is that the malaria drug?
Yeah, hydroxychloroquine is the malaria drug that you use with zinc, ideally, and they were sometimes, I think, giving it with an antibiotic as well. And then ivermectin is a similar deworming agent that's been generic for quite some time. I think they use it in horses and veterinarians. You can still get it on, actually, I think on Amazon as like a paste for horses, but you can't get it from a physician who will give you the proper amount and the right dose regimen for it. But I think this just changed a few weeks ago. So at least I know hydroxychloroquine got reversed when the vaccines went live. I don't know where ivermectin stands, but there is better data on ivermectin, and many physicians pounding their hands on the table in DC trying to get this thing opened up. So we wouldn't have a clogged ICU problem or a clogged hospital problem if we could do outpatient treatment. So many of this, the hospitals are overwhelmed justification for lockdowns is self-imposed. It's the government not letting go of what are already approved drugs. Doctors usually had the freedom to prescribe these things off label, and that was ripped away from them during the pandemic. And that to me looks like they were just parting the Red Sea for their friends to pull other drugs through.
Wait, you mean they changed that doctors were no longer allowed to go off book in order to be able to... And that's not normally the way that works?
No. 2019, you could prescribe these things for outside of rheumatoid arthritis or for other uses. And during the pandemic, they reversed it. Evil.
Well, I mean, like, if that really is true, evil being the definition of the creation of suffering where it's not needed, then yeah, you're right. Like,
and those are my words. You can look up Dr. Peter McCullough from Baylor. He's a leading cardiologist. Was down there explaining this shenanigans to Senator, I think it was Ron Johnson, I believe. But he went over the Surgisphere debacle. The whole New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet retraction. They published these bullshit papers on this drug being harmful, and James Todaro and Twitter, another physician who's well versed in the Bitcoin space, just looked through the data and realized it was a scam. put out a paper describing it as a scam. It wasn't a peer-reviewed paper, but he put it on, I think he put it like on a Google Drive, and the drive got censored. But eventually he was right. And it showed that this Surgisphere company was a spring-up company. We still don't know exactly who funded them, but there are some connections to one of the authors to Gilead, who makes remdesivir. And we saw Gilead also fund the Boulware. Well, he didn't fund the Boulware study. I think they showed that the Boulware study in Minnesota was one that wasn't very favorable on hydroxychloroquine either. There's
Kevin,
some
you might as well be going. We saw in file F1643716 that this was true or this was not true.
Yeah, sorry about that. I should spell out those references a little bit better. But,
no, I don't even mean to spell out the references. I'm saying like an ordinary person like me sits here and says, I have no way of going through and discerning whether what Kevin is saying is true or what the government is saying is true. However, I can say that my experience with coronavirus has led me to believe that the people that are in charge are not making what I would think of as like a continual regular service of good ideas and good decisions. Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.